What's up, guys? Welcome to this episode of the G Team podcast. The G Team is a group of young people dedicated to
providing people with the knowledge to make the most of their life,
sharing practical ways to maximize productivity,
and offering support to those who need it to create a more fulfilled life.
My name is Peter.
And I'm Olu.
And we're your hosts for this podcast.
Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy listening. Welcome to another episode of the G Team podcast. I'm joined by some industry experts here. We've got Johnny and Prina here. So would you both like to just quickly introduce yourself? Johnny, you go first.
Yep, my name is Johnny Gowdy. I'm a director at Regen, and we are, I suppose, a small independent not-for-profit organization that supports the transition to a net zero future, specializing mainly in energy and renewable energy, sustainable energy.
And hi, I'm Prina, and I'm a local energy coordinator at Regen. And I mainly work in the community energy sector, but also within renewables as a whole.
Okay, so can get a little bit of a flavor about what this episode is about from the guests and their description. So we're going to be talking a little bit about climate change today. And in case any of you have not been too aware of what's going on, obviously the past couple of weeks we've had COP26, which is a major event where a lot of the world's leaders have gone together to try and tackle this climate crisis. I was just wondering, Johnny, would you be able to give a brief summary, a little bit of context for what's actually going on? What is there a crisis going on? Like, what's actually happening? What's caused it?
Yes, well, absolutely, there is a crisis. They call it the climate emergency, basically. But to put it into context, we've got about 10, maybe 15 years to really make a difference in terms of our carbon emissions. And if we don't do that, the scientists tell us that we're looking at a minimum of 1.5 degrees global warming, but in reality, we're probably looking at more than 2 degrees global warming. And just to give you some context, I mean, 2 degrees global warming means significant sea level rises. It means much more extreme weather events. It will mean droughts in some parts of the world and increased desertification. It will mean deforestation. It will probably mean the end of coral reefs across the world. It could displace millions of people, and it could actually kill millions of people in terms of hunger and famine and the wars that are likely to come from the climate change impacts. So it's pretty scary when you look at it on a global basis. And I suppose one of the big challenges then is what can we do over the next 10 years that will really make a difference? And you mentioned COP, we'll come back to that, but I suppose that was the big topic at COP. What do we need to do and how quickly do we need to do it?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess you could say there's been a bit more awareness now, a bit more eagerness to get things done. You know, towards the end of COP, for example, you're seeing the US and China actually dealing together to try and share the technology and at least speed up this process of us tackling climate change. So I was wondering, Prina, just in terms of like current and future effects of climate change on a maybe more personal level, at least I can say that I've noticed over the past few years a rise in natural disasters. We're seeing more forest fires, for example, more floods. What are the extremes? So, for example, getting between 1.5 degrees, as we mentioned, above pre-industrial levels and 2 degrees. What's the real difference there? And will the planet still be safe? Will it still be habitable if we go much further than that? What's the real limit?
I don't think any of us, including the scientists, actually know the limit. But what I will say is that we can already see the effects right now, as you said. So I think all of us have seen the forest fires in Australia, in west coast of the US. We've seen flooding in Uganda, Germany, UK, all around the world. And so we're at about 1.2 degrees warming right now, and we're already seeing the heightened effects of the climate crisis, and it will only get worse as we increase in temperature. And I think Johnny's outlined some of the ways in which that's going to happen. And so I guess going back to, what's the worst that could happen? I mean, there's a real possibility if we don't, that we could be seeing societal collapse if we don't change our ways. But on the flip side of that, I just want to turn it a little bit positive. On the flip side of that, we could be seeing a new, greener world that's more just. And we often talk about this in terms of climate justice and saying that what we need to understand with climate change is that it's going to affect the most vulnerable people the most, and they're going to take the brunt of the impact. And so I think whenever we talk about these issues, it's always important to kind of keep that in our minds, and it's going to exacerbate a lot of our current issues. So we talked about famine, for example, and sub-Saharan Africa is going to be hit by quite a lot of the droughts. And it's already happened. We can see in Kenya, for example, there was droughts in the past few years. And so it's kind of just understanding all of that. So I think I answered your question.
Yeah. Like, it's just providing a little bit more context on the issue and like the seriousness of it.
This is a massive.
You mentioned. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Johnny.
I was just saying, this is a massive test for humanity, isn't it? This is a real sort of moment when we really have to look at all those international systems that we have in place. We talk about United Nations and the collaboration that we have, and this is probably even. I mean, I'm hesitant to say, but maybe even bigger than World War II in terms of the global scale of what we have to do. And either we as humanity will respond to this, and the outcome, as Prina says, of that response could actually be good. We might actually learn a lot about the environment. We might actually be able to build back the environment in a better way, in a more equitable way. Or we're going to carry on with the same sort of self-interested, selfish processes, and then the outlook is pretty dire, actually. And it's really hard to know how bad it will be, because there are a number of tipping points that we might reach where we really lose control of the process. And at that point, nature and the environment will take its revenge on us, and we'll be subject to that.
I just want to actually explain what a tipping point is for people who don't necessarily understand. An example that I come back to quite a lot is, for example, peat in Siberia. And what it basically means is that as it warms, we'll release permafrost that used to be frozen and is no longer frozen, and that will release methane into the air. And that basically means that it will get warmer, which will melt more of the permafrost, which means that it'll get warmer and warmer and warmer. And so these tipping points are where we basically release a feedback loop, which we can't come back from.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm guessing there's multiple like natural tipping points that exist in the world. Like, that's just one of them that you mentioned. Greenhouse gas. It's going to contribute to the warming, like you said.
Yeah, deforestation, loss of ice cover, ocean warming, all of these things have the potential to create that sort of negative feedback loop where, we as humanity will struggle then to manage that, because the processes start to operate at a scale at which it becomes very difficult for us to come back from.
Yeah, and obviously, Johnny, before you mentioned this being like a challenge for all of humanity. Like, I wanted to touch on like what needs to be done at a large scale to sort of tackle this issue. And globally, you've mentioned collaboration. Obviously, every country has their own interest at heart. They want to develop themselves. They want to get richer. They want to, use the power that they need to use, whether that's emitting carbon or not. You see in COP26 with China and India, eventually the deal had to get watered down regarding phasing out coal rather than it turned out to be phasing down rather than phasing out. And these are all small things, but a lot of people will be asking why and how come China and India are getting away with this? Like, how come they're phasing out? They're not going to phase out of coal by the limit that other countries have agreed to. Would you be able to just touch on that? Because I think there are some legitimate answers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of a negotiation going on between the developed countries, so the sort of industrialized West and America in particular, the developing countries that are very vulnerable to climate change. So let's think about Africa and parts of the Pacific and South America. And then those countries that are kind of in the process of development, India, China, Brazil, and a number of others. And they've all got slightly different interests, I suppose. They've all got a common interest in protecting the environment, and we need to deal with this global issue, but they're coming at it from a slightly different perspective. I suppose from China and India's point of view, they would look at the West and say, well, you know, you've had 200 years of exploiting fossil fuels. That has enabled you to grow your economy. I know, by the way, you also grew your empire during that time as well and exploited our resources, and we haven't forgotten about that. And now you're asking us to forgo the opportunity of using our resources to grow our economy. And to some extent, it's a political thing. I think that to some extent there are national interests involved, and to some extent it's an economic thing. There's clearly a financial negotiation going on where those developing countries are saying to the West, you know, if we make this sacrifice, if we slow down our development, and they see it as a slowdown of development, which is maybe not correct, but that's how they see it, we want you to compensate us for it. And that's played out at COP. I think it's changing, though. I think the tone has improved. I mean, it's hard to believe that, but given where we were 5 or 10 years ago, I think we've made good progress. And we had a conversation in Regen that COP looks a success if you look back, but it looks like not a success when you look forward at what needs to be done. And I think that's kind of one of the challenges there. But I think the fact we're having those negotiations, I think the fact that coal, fossil fuels is on the agenda has changed things. And the other thing that's changing things is a realization that going green and doing the right thing is not an economic cost. It's actually an economic opportunity. And particularly for developing countries, if they can skip the fossil fuel stage and go straight to renewables and new technologies, that's a massive advantage. Because to be honest with you, you know, nobody really likes fossil fuels. Coal is not a good thing. Even in a developing country, it creates pollution, it affects people's health. It's not a positive. So if we can skip through that, then that's actually a bigger opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of classified countries into 3 sort of categories there. You know, the ones that have already made quite a big start in terms of renewables. You're looking at, you know, the West, for example, China, India, like you said. There's a lot of investment in new renewable technology. And yeah, the third category, we're looking at sort of less economically developed countries who are heavily reliant on fossil fuels right now. They might not necessarily have the infrastructure or the investment necessary to sort of take on these new, cleaner ways of producing energy and power. So how would you say we can tackle that? Like, as humanity, how are we going to enable these countries that don't necessarily have the resources to sort of tackle climate change head on?
Well, I mean, when we say they don't have the resources, it's kind of interesting. Some of those developing countries, I'm thinking about sub-Saharan Africa now, actually have fantastic resources in terms of solar energy, in terms of forests, for example, and parts of South America have got very good hydro energy and potentially offshore and onshore wind. So they do have the natural resources. A lot of those countries also have an imperative because they're on the front line of climate change. So they're the countries that will be most affected by climate change. So there's kind of a natural imperative for them to move forward and to be on side. I think what they're missing is money, is capital, is finance. I mean, these projects are huge capital investments, and it's always been an issue for developing nations to access capital, whether it's for renewable energy or any other sort of infrastructure which is needed, and to some extent, I suppose, the technical and technological access to new technologies, and that can be overcome, I think, very quickly. So I think it's about mobilizing what the West has to offer, which is the finance and the technologies, and putting that together with what the developing nations have to offer in terms of natural resources and their their willingness to change and their ability to change very quickly, which is actually, I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see African countries now really coming to the fore in this area, where they're able to make that step forward. I don't understand why South Africa is still so dependent on coal. I really don't, given that they are surrounded by ocean, surrounded by wind, and have excellent solar. And it seems to me that could change very, very quickly.
Okay. And would you say that's just going to come with, increased awareness, increased incentive as well?
It's incentive. I mean, awareness is great, and everybody wants to do the right thing, but you really need finance in order to make that happen, and you need a change of attitude in the political classes in those countries, and also in their nascent industries to make that change. And it's not so surprising because 10, 15 years ago we were at exactly the same place in the UK. I mean, 15 years ago, when I started out working in renewables, it was seen as a fringe industry. It was seen as it was seen as a minor industry. And now, 10, 15 years later, we're right on the mainstream. So it's not surprising that countries are having to change and adapt to this.
Okay. And obviously, we've already touched on COP, like a decent amount, but Prina, would you be able to just like touch on maybe the key sort of takeaways from COP and the event this year? What were the main sort of goals going into it, and then
you were there, Prina.
Over what were the key findings? What are the key agreements that we managed to secure?
Yes, I might need Johnny to back me up in a minute here, but the ones that I did go up for COP. Actually, I went up to Glasgow. And there was a really incredible atmosphere. Actually, I was not invited to the Blue Zone, unfortunately, but I went to a lot of fringe events, and it was really interesting to see the level of kind of commitment from a lot of people to this cause. And anyway, so back to your question. Like Johnny mentioned earlier, there was, and I think you mentioned as well, the coal. That's quite a big thing. The phase down of coal. There was the Deforestation pledge. So I believe that accounts for 91% of forests to stop deforestation by 2030. There was also the methane pledge, which was, I'm not sure how many countries were involved in that. But yeah, so it was methane is another greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide, and actually a lot more potent than carbon dioxide. So reducing that is also going to be important in tackling climate change. And lastly, it was the first time that loss and damages had been agreed on at a COP. So it wasn't what as much as the developing countries wanted, and it's also been delayed, I believe. But that was kind of the main positives of COP. And then there's also every COP, the countries come in with nationally declared contributions to how they're going to reduce, how much they're going to reduce their emissions by. And so this year, coming into Glasgow, we were on track. If everyone kept their commitments from Paris, which was 5 years ago, we were on track for a 2.7 degrees warming. And so we've talked a little bit about these numbers, and the aim that we all agreed on 5 years ago was 1.5. And after COP, it's at 2.4 if all of the countries commit and deliver on their national NDCs. So obviously that's not good enough if we want to create a world that we want, and it kind of means millions of people are going to suffer if we carry on. But what was also agreed with COP was that next year, COP27 in Egypt, they'll come back with strengthened NDCs. So that's the kind of next step, is that all the countries agree to come back again next year with strengthened NDCs so that we can try to keep 1.5 alive. So I hope that's a summary. Johnny, did I miss anything from that?
I think you got it all. The only one I might throw in, which was kind of a side thing to the official COP, was the various financial institutions and I think there's about 200 world financial institutions that signed up to channeling investment into green and low carbon solutions. And together they control, I think it's $130 trillion. So it's a huge amount of money. I mean, it's one of those big numbers that you then wonder, well, how do you actually measure that, and who's actually going to count that? But it's kind of an impressive sounding number. And I guess there's quite a lot of that in COP, where there's a lot of commitments, but most of it is voluntary, and most of it's based on, individual countries or individual, organizations doing their bit. And there isn't a global police force to make sure that everybody does it. And we're kind of, and that's both a strength and a weakness, I would say. It's obviously a concern about people not fulfilling their commitments, but on the other hand, it's probably the easiest way to make things happen quickly is to let people kind of have a degree of freedom to go about it in their own way. And I mean, going back to that theme about was COP a success or not? I mean, as Prina's just said, in reality, it wasn't enough. We didn't get the commitments that we need to achieve 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So, by a hard measure, you would say, it didn't deliver. On the other hand, if I was being positive, it has created a momentum, and it's what happens next that's important. So we can either, the expression they use is to ratchet. We can either ratchet up from the point that we've got to, and actually drive forward and make that, make further ambitions and deliver more, or we might sit back and rest on our laurels. And it's what we do next that is really, really important. And one of the guys at COP, Nigel Topping, who is the global UN climate champion, I think his title is, and he talks about politicians being behind what he calls the real economy. So the politicians will make a commitment, set a level of ambition, which is not really enough, but the real economy then kicks in. So by that I mean organizations, businesses, public sector, you and me, and we all respond. And that then allows politicians, or it gives politicians the confidence that they need to then make a further commitment. And as an example of that, we've seen that in the UK with electric vehicles, where the government made a commitment to eradicate diesel and petrol engines by 2040 originally. And everyone said that's not enough. And people, consumers, manufacturers of vehicles, etc., all went back to government and said, well, we can do better than that, and we're moving forward. And then within a couple of years, the government had brought that commitment forward. Initially, they said 2035, and now they're saying 2030. So that's a kind of a ratcheting effect where we see an ambition which is not enough being brought forward. And that's what we really need to see out of COP now. We need to see, all of society, all those financial institutions, all those businesses, academics, NGOs, etc., piling the pressure on that then will enable politicians to be more ambitious next time around.
Yeah, I think another thing that emerged anyway post COP26. Prina, you already mentioned there's going to be a COP27 next year where the country will review the progress that's been made and sort of give updates. I believe they've agreed to do that like sort of every single year, and whereas it's not going to be like such a big gap as it was between Paris Agreement and this COP26. So that's going to show that with Johnny, as you've been mentioning, as different sectors sort of develop, as new technology is developed as well, the governments are going to be able to sort of update their plans. Maybe some of these commitments and sort of the way that deals were watered down in this COP, maybe we will see some progress there. But we've spoken quite a lot about what large institutions, countries, governments can do in terms of climate change. But on a more of a individual basis, what can we do? What are the main things, that sort of life changes that we should probably start to adopt if we want to sort of make a difference in reducing our own personal carbon footprint, for example?
I would say that we definitely need to we definitely need to reduce our own personal carbon footprint, especially us in the global north, where our footprints are much higher, significantly higher than those in the global south, and that goes by reducing consumption. But also, the reality is that our government, the UK government, is not doing enough, and we also need to take part in that collective action to, as Johnny was just saying, like pile on the pressure, make sure that they are sticking to their agreements, but also going more. Currently, it's not ambitious enough. Their policies are not good enough in a lot of aspects, and some they are, but a lot is not. An example of that is they're going ahead with a new oil field in the North Sea called Cambo. And so it's stuff like taking part as a collective with the people around us, because as a collective we have a much greater voice and much greater power than we do as individuals. Not saying that we shouldn't do our individual actions. And I think what I always also say is we need to change our mindset. We need to continue to learn. We need to continue to be open to learn about this topic, because it's just, you cannot do it in one. There's not one action that we can do. So my answer is not a single task, but it's kind of to carry on learning, carry on understanding this topic further, and take part in collective action, because that also leads to personal action.
Yeah, I agree with that. Collective action. I mean, the protest thing. I mean, I think the Conservative politicians were really, really rattled, not by Extinction Rebellion, but when the school kids came out. Because, I mean, if you're a Conservative politician and the school kids are coming out and the parents in the playground are telling you, I mean, that is bad. I mean, that is like getting mauled, basically. So I think those sorts of things are really, really important. I think the other thing in terms of personal action, I mean, you're an engineering student. So your decision about how you use your engineering skills, what career you pursue, what industry you want to work in, that's a really important decision, because when we talk about divesting from fossil fuels in terms of financial capital, but the human capital that fossil fuels rely on as well. So those sorts of decisions are really important. And then, as Prina said, reducing your own carbon footprint, which is hard because we live in a system which is kind of designed around carbon. So, I mean, there's things that we can do to reduce our usage of, private transport, use public transport, eat less meat, install energy efficiency, but many people are living in rental sector. You young people generally don't have the ability or the control over the property in order to do those sorts of things. So we do need systematic changes, structural changes to make those things happen, to enable individuals to then make the right decisions and make better choices about their carbon footprint. So I think there's a combination of, individual action, but system changes that are needed.
Okay, and obviously you just mentioned me being an engineer, and I just wanted to quickly touch on any new technological sort of systems that are being developed, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's just something as simple as installing a heat pump in the house rather than a boiler. What would you say the key emerging technologies are right now? Like what stuff are you excited about? What do you think is going to bring about a lot of change with regards to the climate crisis?
Well, there's stuff I'm excited about, and then there's stuff that will make the change. So, I mean, right now, the stuff that will help us change is already established. It's wind, it's solar, it's offshore wind. I suppose is probably the most exciting area in terms of scalability and growth. It's insulation in your roof. It's all those sorts of things that we already know about and can be deployed at scale. And those will make the biggest difference over the next decade, which is the key decade. But looking ahead and the things that make you excited, I mean, the development of hydrogen as an alternative fuel, particularly for industry and those really hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation, maritime, etc., where you need a higher energy density fuel. And so that's going to be a real breakthrough. And if we can get the whole energy system to work, where our excess wind, solar, electricity generation is then used to convert into hydrogen. That could be a real sort of game changer. The other thing that's getting me excited actually is the whole negative emissions. So, planting trees, reforesting, rewilding. And that's where, as Prina said at the beginning, we might see some benefits from this process. We might actually start to do the right thing for a change. And that's not just going to bring carbon savings, it's going to bring a whole bunch of benefits to humanity and benefits to the planet as well. And that's kind of an area that I think has probably been overlooked, but is a really exciting area for us. Maybe from an engineering point of view or a technical point of view, the frontier of innovation isn't so much developing individual technologies. It's about putting them all together into a system that works. And so, I mean, we know that we can create renewable electricity. Then the question is, how can we use that to address issues in transport? Or how do we use that to decarbonize heat or to make steel? Those are the things. So from an energy point of view, it's not so much the individual generation assets. It's actually bringing the system together, because it's integration. Because we've had 200 years to integrate a fossil fuel system, and now we've got 15 years to integrate a renewable system, and that's the kind of difference in terms of speed of development that we need to see. And making that all work, and making it work in a way which Prina mentioned at the beginning is equitable, because we could see lots of winners and losers happening here. We could see people being left behind, unable to access the smart technologies, unable to access, energy itself. And we know that that's absolutely vital, particularly in developing countries. So it's not, the challenge for us isn't about just doing it, it's doing it in a way which is equitable.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say thank you for your time. And it's just been a really good discussion. I've learned a lot, even just in this past half an hour. But before we close off the episodes, do you have any closing remarks? Maybe some words of encouragement for anyone that's listening?
Prina, you go first.
I would say that we need everyone in this fight and everyone's skills in this fight. So whatever your skills are, whatever you enjoy doing, bring them, and enjoy it while you're here as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, for young people especially, it's possible that this becomes almost overwhelming, and I guess can be make people quite anxious. And I would encourage young people to look at the positives here and the opportunities that they have, and particularly if you're thinking about choosing A-level subjects or going to university, etc. There is a wealth of opportunities in the new kind of green economy. And if you're not interested in being in the green economy, then there's a wealth of opportunities in terms of supporting society. And if you can't do any of that, then you can glue yourself to the door of BP, and that's a really useful thing to do. So, yeah, go ahead.
And I just want to do a shout out to artists. I was just going to do a shout out to artists in that, because actually we often forget about the kind of creative sectors and the art sector, and actually they're vital as well.
Yeah, we need
it's a technical challenge, but then I'd say they've done a great job in terms of raising awareness in the first place. I think a lot of people, maybe 10 years ago, they might have known about the climate crisis, but maybe there wasn't that emotional attachment to it. But now people seem to be a bit more passionate, a bit more motivated, and like you said, it's everyone getting involved, and that's what's really made the difference. But
absolutely,
yeah, I think we'll leave it there for now. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your questions. Bye now.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to the G-Team podcast. You can catch more episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more, where we try to build our lives one step at a time.